Hello, everyone, and welcome to this podcast edition of Listening to America. I had the extraordinary joy today of conducting an interview with one of the people I most respect, my friend Dr. Larry Skogen, Emeritus President of Bismarck State College, the author of a number of books, two of them on Native Americans. The first one was called Indian Depredation Claims, about a commission set up by Congress to compensate white people who were frontiersmen whose property or lives were damaged by Native American depredations, as they were called. And this new book, To Educate American Indians, Selected Writings from the National Education Association's Department of Indian Education, 1900 to 1904. It's a set of important documents about the assimilation movement. It's a really difficult problem, one of the most intractable problems in the world, because the bottom line on all of this is that Euro-Americans were not going to turn back and go to Spain, Portugal, and England and say, well, no, it's a new continent, but it already has its own sovereign peoples. Let's just trade with them or leave them alone. But it's not our continent. Well, we know that's not going to happen. We know that doesn't fit. Well, then what should our relation be with Native peoples? And this continues to be a conundrum to this day. Things are better now. But the United States, as a country born with an idealistic mission, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights and Constitution, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which called for treating natives with the utmost good faith and never dispossessing them without consultation, due process, and compensation. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is one of the most important documents in American history, and it demanded the utmost good faith, that's a direct quotation, with respect to Native peoples. It's a horrible, tragic story, and historians have to go in and find a place in this 300-year dynamic to do research and help to clarify it. And so Larry Skogen has been doing this through his whole career. And this book, To Educate American Indians, Selected Writings, and his introductions and annotations, is about the assimilation process. And so by the end of the 19th century, the idea was we need to absorb Native Americans into the broader Anglo-American culture, and we will do this by teaching them English and forbidding them to speak their native languages, by dressing them like non-natives, by making sure their hair is styled the way non-natives wear their hair, that their religions and their rites and traditions will be outlawed. I mean, literally outlawed, powwows outlawed, potlatches outlawed, and that they will then slowly be brought in to the mix of white America, and at some point they'll be no different from Irish Americans and Norwegian Americans and German Americans and Italian Americans and Slavic Americans. They will be Americans with an ethnic tinge. That was the idea. Well, how do you do that? Because the Native peoples weren't saying, hey, we want to be just like you. Teach us how to be just like white Americans. They resisted. They resisted so successfully that Native people still exist today, and their cultures are in some recovery, and their sovereignty is increasingly respected, particularly by U.S. federal courts. So Larry looked at these documents, the National Education Association's Department of Indian Education, and then provided context. So I urge you to take a look at the book, but I also think that the conversation is a broader conversation about where we are now. How did we get here with white Indian relations, if I can use that term? How did we get to this point where there is a much greater sensitivity towards Native American culture and rights and sovereignty today than ever before in American history? And now we have a land back movement, and there are land acknowledgments, and all sorts of things are happening in a preliminary way to begin to right some of the grossest of the wrongs that occurred. It's fascinating. It's deeply troubling. Larry's an amazing person. I've known him for 20 years now, and I have the greatest respect for him. And I love it that he's doing this, because he had a very, very successful career in the Air Force, and then as a college administrator. He was the president of Bismarck State College for more than a decade. He got a building named after him recently. Instead of just retiring and leading the good life, instead he decided to dig in and do this. It's not very glamorous work, to dig in and do serious, fundamental scholarship to make it possible for all of us to contextualize the history of assimilation. And I'm just so proud of what he's doing, proud to be his friend, delighted that he's chosen this path, and he's not done yet. A second volume is coming in 2025 or maybe 2026. So these are really important things, and I don't think we can talk about America at 250 without having a national conversation about Native America in our history and in the 21st century and beyond. So let's go to the show. If you can help us, of course, we'd be thrilled and honored, because I think we're doing really important work here. And Larry is about as wonderful and affable a person as you will meet. You'll hear his humor, and his extraordinary capacity to synthesize information and present it to a wider audience. So Larry Skogen, the author of To Educate American Indians, Selected Writings from the National Education Association's Department of Indian Education, 1900 to 1904. Let's go to the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America. I have the great joy and pleasure today of having a conversation with one of my dearest friends, Dr. Larry Skogen. Dr. Skogen is the emeritus president of Bismarck State College, now with a building named after you, Larry, the author of several books, including most recently To Educate American Indians, Selected Writings from the National Education Association's Department of Indian Education, 1900 to 1904. Larry is an Air Force officer. You were a professor at the U.S. Air Force Academy. You came to Bismarck about 20 years ago now and became, in my opinion, the best ever president of Bismarck State College. But here's what I find so important about you, Larry. Many administrators are not scholars. Increasingly, as you know, university administrators are business people because what they do is raise money and deal with legislatures. You are a scholar president. You could easily now have retired, enjoyed the good life, which I'm sure you're doing, but you used your time to put together this book, which is an amazing thing. You know, your scholarship doesn't end with the administrative end of your career. So welcome to this program.
Well, Clay, thank you. It's wonderful to be here with you, and you've said way too many nice things about me. So,
well, let me say the other things then. But you know, you for a time you were the temporary chancellor of higher education in North Dakota. You were the president or the master of a military school at Roswell.
I was a deputy superintendent there.
Right.
So there was a president that was. We called him the superintendent, but anyway.
How long were you at the Air Force Academy?
Well, I had 2 tours there, I guess 6 years total. I was there 3 years. And then at that time, the Air Force Academy created its own pool of PhDs for its accreditation and would send off active duty Air Force officers to pursue PhDs. And so I was very, very fortunate to be selected for one of those slots. And my interest has been, since graduate school, my interest has been in federal Indian policy. And so I got selected to go off for a PhD program, and I wanted to study federal Indian policy. And so I studied under Dr. Robert Trennert at Arizona State University. And Clay, you will not believe the reactions that people would, the reactions I would get from people when they would say, so you're an active duty Air Force officer. And I was the richest graduate student on the campus. And then they'd say, well, what are you here studying? And I said, well, I'm studying under Dr. Trennert, federal Indian policy. And the weird looks I got, somehow they thought, well, the Air Force is only going to send people off to get PhDs in some astro thing, aviation, something, whatever.
Strategic thinking or geopolitics.
Yeah, but the Air Force Academy is an institution of higher learning, and it ran the whole gamut of the types of stuff that we taught in the history department as well as all the other departments. And so my interest is federal Indian policy. The Air Force needed PhDs, so I was very, very fortunate in being selected to go off, get my PhD in federal Indian policy, which surprised most people to say the least.
So your first book was Indian Depredation Claims. What brought you to Native American studies? What you grew up in Hettinger, North Dakota. What made you so interested in this broad subject?
Well, that was an evolutionary process. I think from the very beginning, because I grew up started life at least at a farm north of Hettinger. We would walk out into the pasture south of our house, and there were teepee rings out there. And this is a time when Dad would go out and plow, and he'd come back in that he had found, while plowing, he'd found an axe head or he'd found an arrow point or something, and he had quite a collection of stuff he found. The evolutionary process is that I was first just very, very interested in the culture that had lived on the Great Plains. And my dad was one who, would remind us. We would go out to the circles, and he'd say, there were people here before us. They lived here, and I know there's still some conversation about whether teepee rings are actually teepee rings or are they ceremonial sites or whatever they are, but nevertheless, we call them teepee rings. And when we would travel, he would make sure we would go down to Mesa Verde in Colorado, and we would walk among the cliff dwellings. And if there were a site someplace that had anything to do with native culture, Dad was interested. And so my evolution was just starting off with just kind of an interest in that. And then once I actually started studying history, when I went back for first my bachelor's degree and then a master's degree, and then I started to look at, one, I know I'm not native, and I knew that my perspective would be different than natives if I were trying to study, quote, native history, unquote. And so instead, I thought that the right thing for this guy to be studying would be the very unique relationship between Native Americans and the federal government. I don't think there's any other relationship like it in the world. You can go back to 1492 when all this started with the colonialism and how European governments interacted with Native nations, and then how the young United States sort of adopted that colonial structure in dealing with Native Americans. Intellectually, I was just very interested in that very unique relationship. And the depredation claims that you mentioned, that's part of understanding how the federal government interacted with the Native nations, but really that was more, the Indians are almost abstract in that. It was really a policy in dealing with the settlers, the white settlers that were out pushing through in the frontier. Of course, the education that the most recent book is about, you can go back to colonial times. How are we going to deal with these people that are so different from Europeans and have different ideas and different cultures and different motivations and so forth? And so then education becomes the mechanism by which the United States government is going to deal with its native nations. And so anyway, my interest was evolutionary, very interested in natives. And eventually, by the time I started studying it on sort of an intellectual basis, I became very interested in the special relationship between native nations and the United States.
The question was, after Columbus bumped into the New World, and especially when the United States was born in the 18th century, how are we going to handle the fact that the country, the continent, has indigenous people, and what will our relationship be with them? Will we share the history of this continent? Will we remove them? Will we conquer them? How does this fit in our constitutional order? This is a really serious problem that is not resolved yet.
Correct. You want a response to that? From the very beginning, Europeans believed in their superiority. From the very beginning, they had a superior culture, they had a superior religion, they had superior languages. Of course, the natives did not have a written language. Most of the natives of North America did not have a written language. The Europeans just believed that they were superior across the board. And so from the very beginning, when they landed, the first issue of superiority is that once they decided, and this was decided by the Pope in about 1517 or so, that the natives had souls. And once it was decided that they had souls, then the responsibility of the good Christians coming to the shores was to make sure that those souls were saved by making them Christian. And so the educational thrust from the very beginning was Christianizing the people they interacted with. Now, keeping in mind that, 13 little colonies on the East Coast, a very broad continent, and very powerful native nations all the way across. And so these early efforts of Christianizing the natives touched on very few natives.
The options are you can turn back and leave North America to its indigenous people. That wasn't in the cards. You can find ways to share by creating Indian country or places that will always be reserved and non-Indians will just work around that. Or you can conquer them, and there are rights of conquest under just law theory and so on. Or you can assimilate them and make them, in a certain sense, conform to the programs, the ways of life, the softwares of white Euro-derived civilization. And I remind our listeners that both Jefferson and Washington were wrestling with this. Washington said, Larry, Well, they'll just kind of disappear as we move west. It's like the wolves. When you move west, the wolves somehow just disappear. And Jefferson said, well, we'll have to encourage them to remove themselves beyond harm's way. But nobody wanted to face the fact that this was a fundamental moral dilemma that the people who came to the New World from Europe were going to have to face.
And Jefferson also believed that eventually, as you know, that the blood of Indians would run through the veins of Americans. So he believed, one of the arrows in his assimilationist quiver was intermarriage. As the frontier moved west, Indians would simply be absorbed into that society. And, and he told them that, once you understand our laws and once you understand owning property and once you understand all this, you're going to want this. You're going to want to be part of us. And when you become part of us, then through our veins will run your blood.
But we would also gain something from them. Not only would there be an amalgamation of bloodlines, but he believed that there were things about Native culture, fierce independence, small d democracy. They were sort of Rousseauian beings in a state of nature, and they had something to teach us about liberty. So Jefferson is a bit of a dreamer, I would say, on this question, right?
Right. What Europeans failed to do in this whole process is ask the Indians what they wanted.
To this day, this is the case. I mean, there are still crises around North America in which non-Indians, non-natives, presume what's best for economic development, industrial development, pipelines, and natives are now at the table increasingly. But for the most part, European-derived Americans have decided what natives want and then have imposed it on them, right?
Correct. And that's been the whole process of assimilation. Again, the idea that European culture was superior, and I suppose from a European perspective, and this is being too generous here, but by golly, if they, a European saying, if the Indians would just dress like us and would just accept Christianity and would speak English and would start farming on small plots of land and would stop this hunter-gathering stuff, if they would do all that, they would be happy because they would be just like us, which of course denied their own heritage and their own cultures and their own beliefs. But again, Europeans didn't bother to ask the natives what they wanted.
I'm talking to my friend, Dr. Larry Skogen, about his new book, To Educate American Indians, Selected Writings from the National Education Association's Department of Indian Education, 1900 to 1904. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. My guest, Dr. Larry Skogen. Larry, after the reservation systems occurred, sort of half-heartedly invented, it wasn't really an extraordinary national policy. It just sort of happened, and my sense of it is that the reservations were meant to be temporary holding places, not the final settlement of what was going to happen. And so this is where your book picks up. Let's create schools to teach them English, teach them our constitutional system, our due process. Let's find a way to Americanize them and make them like us, only they have a native ethnicity. How well did that work out, my friend?
What's really interesting, Clay, in the time period that I look at in this book, 1900 to 1909, is that we really get to see a picture of when the ideas of how to assimilate Native Americans came into direct conflict. Let's take Richard Pratt, for example, Carlisle Indian Industrial School, 1879. He believed that natives could be assimilated into white society, and you could do that if they would just stop being Indians. That was his whole argument. They have to stop being Indians. And once they stop being Indians and you bring them to this boarding school in the East, like Carlisle or Hampton, he actually started in Hampton. He took some prisoners from Fort Marion, Florida, and took them to Hampton, Virginia, and spent a year there. and he's going to educate them, the natives. And in that process, he had some wonderful promotional pictures and he used them to raise funds. Before and after pictures, where he would take a picture of natives that came from the Great Plains dressed in their native clothing, take a picture of them, and then put them in school. I should start off by cutting their hair, changing their clothes, putting them in school, and a year or two or three later, take another picture of that same group of Indians, and he'd say, look at what we have done. We have turned them into white citizens, and they look like us. They're educated like us. They can work like us. And as long as we don't send them back to the reservation, they're going to be fine. And so that was his view. Starting during the 1890s, the idea of scientific racism starts taking over this conversation. And a woman by the name of Estelle Real, who becomes superintendent of Indian schools in 1898, is a big promoter now of scientific racism, which meant, and this is where we see a lot of terms like the child race. Natives were just not as evolutionary developed as whites were. And so now the focus changes. Now there's arguments that we don't have to take them off the reservation. We can keep them in day schools or maybe reservation boarding schools. They can still interact with their families. We're still going to educate them. They've got to speak English. They've got to be Christians. And now we're going to teach them manual labor. They really can't, according to Estelle Real and the progressive educators of the time, they really can't understand higher mathematics. There's no reason to waste your time in ancient history. They need to be able to count enough and make change so that they know that the storekeeper's not cheating them. That's about all they needed. And then they can integrate into society as a laboring class. So these two ideas of assimilation really come head to head during this time period of the early 20th century. Richard Pratt writes a letter to Estelle Real at one point where she's saying, and one of the things she's saying is preserving native art. She did not want to kill off the Indianness. That was Pratt's idea. Kill the Indian, save the man. Okay.
Which he actually said. I mean, that becomes the motto of the movement. Kill the Indian, save the man. That there's a human being in there that we can wean of Indianness, who will then be better able to fit into our civilization.
Exactly. And Estelle Real, her assimilationist idea is kind of a half step there. Well, we don't have to kill off the Indianness because you know what? They can make very good rugs, and they could sell those rugs. They can make good pottery. They can make good baskets. So what we need to do is we need to promote the sale of Indian art. We need to preserve that. Well, at the same time, we're going to take the individual and make that individual into an English-speaking Christian laborer for our society.
Let me ask a different kind of question about this, because when we look at this from the vantage point of the 21st century, a lot of this makes us cringe and even feel ashamed of American Indian policy. It's important, and I know this is central to your own thinking, that most of the people who were doing this, most of the white people who were doing this, regarded themselves as philanthropists and friends to the Indian. In other words, these are people that were not open racists who had sort of exterminationist views and who had no respect for Native people. Most of these people, these white people, were wanting to do what they regarded as the right thing.
Right, but the one thing you said, they were not open racists. They were open racists. It's just a different kind of racism. It was the scientific racism. The old Western saying, the only good Indian is a dead Indian, right? Now, there's a racist, that we need to exterminate the Indians and that they can, in fact, there were arguments at this time that they can never be civilized. That it is not in them to be civilized, and therefore we're going to have to kill them off and exterminate them. The bold Western racist was the one that thought the Indians needed to be exterminated. The scientific racist is one that said, no, we don't have to exterminate them. We can train them. We can provide sort of rudiments of an education to them. And we're going to do that because we're good Christians. So, so most of these reformers, in fact, I would say, I mean, I don't have the data on this, Clay, but I'll say that the reformers that considered themselves friends of the Indians were Christians, and they believed they were doing the Christian thing by training the Indian to work within, to labor within white society.
And their view was, what can we do here? I mean, we have this problem. It's always been called the Indian problem. They're not going to be exterminated. They continue to exist biologically. Their way of life is incompatible with our industrial economic system. As you said earlier, white people believe they'd be much better off if they adopted the English language, that they have access to metal, the domestication of animals, private property rights, and so on. So this is a conundrum. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is that it's so easy for us to condemn all of these white people who were involved in policy, but it's more complicated than that, because they were really wrestling with an intractable problem, which continues to be a largely intractable problem into the 21st century. And so the question is, well, what should we do? And the idea was, well, Irish people come here and they become Irish Americans, but they still have St. Patrick's Day and so on, and Germans still have German cuisine and so on. Why can't we bring Native Americans into that same mix where they're just like us, but they have some Indianness about ceremonies and other things that are of no consequence to our national enterprise? You've done all this really interesting work. This book consists largely of documents, which you have introduced and then annotated. There are many references and allusions that really required your sort of annotation. But these are people who are trying to figure out what's the right thing to do here, and how can we make this country more harmonious, and how can we do justice by natives without ever granting them full agency, full validity.
Right. If I can respond to that, first let's talk about the book for just a minute, because I try to do three things with the book.
Okay.
And then I'll get back to exactly what you're talking about. The first thing I wanted to do, and by the way, I should say there's the second book. This is 1900 to 1904. The second one is 1905 to 1909. That will cover the entire life of the Department of Indian Education within the National Education Association. It lasted 10 years. And so the first thing I wanted to do is tell that story. And so the two books collectively tell the story from the beginning to the end of that department. The second thing that I wanted to do is I wanted to introduce these educators to people. So every paper that's presented, I start off first by establishing the history of the department that year, whatever was going on that year. And then secondly, then introducing these people before I present their papers so that we know who they are. We know where they're from. We know what they did prior to then. We know what they did after that. And then I present their paper, as you mentioned, annotate it so that if they make references in there, people can look it up and they can see what they're talking about. So those are the three main things that I wanted to accomplish with that. And to your point that you just made, I received a beautiful email from a woman that read this book, and she said, when I started it, I believed that I was going to hate these Indian school educators. And she said, when I got done, I found out I didn't hate them, but I understood them better. And that, to me, is one of the best compliments I've ever gotten on the book.
Absolutely. Bingo. She got it.
This is what I wanted to do, is to be able to introduce these people. I'm not defending them by any means, okay? But we need to understand that just as wonderful literature has told us the consequences of Indian education in the boarding schools, and there's a lot of really good literature out there, and a lot of really good literature by natives whose grandparents or great-grandparents were subjected to boarding schools or just the Indian school environment itself. That story tells us what happened to those folks. This story tells us the story of the people that were actually doing it. And so when we hear about Indian boarding schools, one of the things that I've said to myself many times when I first started in this project, what were they thinking? Well, now I can kind of tell you what they were thinking. Now, in some cases, they're terrible people. Yeah, I tell folks, you always know that you're talking about an Indian boarding school if it has a jail and has a cemetery. Those are the two things that an Indian boarding school is going to have. The jail, what's that for? Well, incalcitrant students would get locked up. Students would run away. And when they ran away, there are advertisements in the newspapers that say, so-and-so going by the name of such and such has run away, needs to be returned to whatever school it is. And then when they came back, there was a jail. There was terrible sexual abuse that's documented in many, many books, and terrible physical abuse, terrible mental abuse. I'm not defending any of that. But what I am arguing is that these are people that believed, as you were saying, that they were doing the right thing and they were working in these schools. And by golly, it was their Christian duty to make sure that these students would become good Christian American citizens laboring within our society. Hopefully, I've captured that in introducing these papers and presenting the papers. Again, I'm not defending at all what happened. I'm just asking that we understand better what happened, not defending what happened.
Of course. I remember when you hosted a symposium on the campus of Bismarck State, and Dennis Banks from the American Indian Movement was here, and he talked about the boarding schools and how if he or his colleagues did something wrong, they would be made to kneel down on a broomstick under their knees for extended periods of time. And he said, you have no idea how excruciating that was, in addition to being, shaming. When you look at these before and after pictures of the native coming in traditional regalia with braids and so on, and then 3 years or 4 years later, the picture of that same person in a button-down shirt and a vest and so on, do we have any real knowledge, Larry, of how successful this was? What happened? Did these individuals then, did we achieve what we wanted? They became sort of white man's Indians?
There are many reports, and in some of these papers, in this book and in the second book that's yet to be published, it is going through the process right now, there are reports where they say, well, how successful were we? And let's take a look at this. And the reality is that one of their biggest concerns at the Indian schools is that when a student returned home to the reservation, that they would backslide into being an Indian again. That was their biggest concern. Now, obviously, there were native doctors and there were native lawyers that did assimilate into society. I'm not so sure that they stopped being Indians. Angel Decorah, who was a native from Nebraska, was taken to Hampton and educated at Hampton, and then she went to some other schools, and she became a well-known artist and illustrator of books and publications and in major magazines. And then she ended up back at Carlisle teaching again. I suppose people would point at her and say that it was successful. I mean, take a look at Angel Decorah, how successful it was. But if you read what she said, and in 1907, she presented a paper in Los Angeles at the meeting there. And if you read what she's saying, she's actually saying that what the Indians' natural artistic bents are, we need to be preserving. So it wasn't a matter like Pratt that we need to get rid of all this stuff, that what the natives were doing was worth preserving. But I don't think that the natives themselves would say that they stopped being Diné or Lakota or Laguna or Apache, that they continued to be those, but they also recognized that they were all being treated as Indians.
Right. So Larry, you've been to these places. I've been to Carlisle. We walk through the cemetery and it's just horrifying. You see the name of a native person died at the age of 12 of a broken heart. But many of the natives who went through this came back to the reservations and said, now I don't have any world. I'm no longer really a Lakota, and my own Lakota people don't really recognize me in quite the same way, but I'm not a white person either. So now I'm stuck between worlds. How prominent was that?
Well, I don't know that I can answer that, Clay, because we're two white guys talking about this.
Yeah, we are.
However, having said that, when you look at the literature, I guess there's two things. On one hand, you can see coming out of the schools are the folks that become cultural brokers. And so now they have learned how to operate in two worlds as a result of this experience. But I also, in the literature, you also see the example of what you just said, and that is a student gets educated, comes back. In some of these cases, they were educated for years at Carlisle, for example, in the East. And then they had what was called the outing, where they were basically hired out to local farmers, or young girls were hired out as domestic servants. And by the time they came back home, they had lost their language. And so obviously that's a problem. It had to be very tough. Let's put it that way. It had to be very tough. I'm not an expert on that, and I didn't have to live through that.
It's an interesting question. How much of this was coercive, and how much, and to what extent were Native peoples willing to send their children to Carlisle or Hampton or to Haskins in Kansas and so on?
Well, there's a lot of evidence that they were compelled to do this because folks lived in so much poverty. They depended on rations, for example, from the federal government. And if they did not send their children, then the Indian agent would withhold the rations. Well, yeah, so they say, well, they voluntarily sent them. No, they didn't. They were compelled to send them. One of the other things you see happening is that on some of these schools, let's say Haskell, I went through a number of letters there trying to understand some of the students that ended up giving a demonstration class in 1909. And in reading those letters, I found it very interesting that there were letters from parents who had made the decision to send a child to a boarding school. And why? Because they were living in abject poverty. So they're living in poverty on a reservation where they have 3 or 4 kids or 5, and they decide they can feed 3 of them. So the 2 oldest ones, they say, you're going to Haskell. Because once they're at Haskell, they're fed, they're clothed. As deplorable as some of the conditions could be at some of these boarding schools, the reality is that unless they were put on limited rations because they kept running away, but they were fed and they were clothed. The
basic health care was available to them. There were services. So that this is an option.
Back home, was saying, now I don't have to feed 5 kids, I'm feeding 3 kids.
Larry, we need to take another break. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Having a fascinating conversation with my friend Dr. Larry Skogen to educate American Indians, selected writings from the National Education Association's Department of Indian Education, 1900 to 1904. We'll be back in just a moment. Stay tuned, everyone. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. Larry Skogen, when you wrote your first book, I picture you sitting in the National Archives of the United States day after day, calling up a file, looking at the file, either typing notes or handwriting out notes. That's a very complex, difficult, expensive, time-consuming process. How much of what you could do with this book and the one that's coming benefited from the digitization of culture, the internet?
That's a wonderful question because not only, first, I really got into this topic during COVID. Okay, I retired from the presidency at Bismarck State College in July of 2020. We were in the heart of the COVID shutdowns. And so what I found out then, a couple of things. First is, since I did the research on the depredation claims, and you're absolutely right, I did all of that at the National Archives, either in Washington or in California or in Denver, actually pulling out the documents and flipping through the documents and trying to make copies of them and making notes of them and doing all that sort of stuff. But with this, on the internet, there are amazing documents that are digitized, just as you're so involved in the digitization of documents at Jenkinson State for the Teddy Roosevelt Center there. So there's a lot of documents that are available online. And then I found out I was working with folks up in Washington, University of Washington, and they had an unbelievable thing where they would pull the files. I was sitting in New Mexico, just on a Zoom call, just like you and I are now. They'd pull the files. They had a camera there set up, and they would flip through the files with this camera set up. And then I would say, next one. Then I would say, hold it. And then I would capture that particular image. But what's really amazing are the number of journals and newspapers that are now available online. And you can do a word search, and everything that had a Stell reel in 1909 in Denver on a newspaper would pop up, and then you can read the articles that mentioned her, and then you can download the page.
So you come upon something in a document, and then you need, well, I wonder what that is. In the old days, you would go to a reference library and spend time trying to figure out how am I even going to figure out how to get at this thing. Now you can go to newspapers.com or JSTOR or just the internet, and data point after data point pops up. Did you find anything that you couldn't identify from these documents?
Nothing comes to mind.
Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is amazing what you can do with word searches out there. You stumble across something, you find a reference in a paper, and you go, I wonder what they're talking about. The key to that is, I think, sticking with it. You got to figure out, okay, so what word search should I do to try to uncover this? One guy was talking about something and that we can't take races and standardize them like my friend said about the railroad. So I'm going, well,
who's your friend?
Well, who's your friend and what is he saying? And I did word searches and just stuck with it. And I probably spent a day or two trying to figure out what he was talking about. And by golly, I found a guy that talked about the fact that races are the race of people are different, and you can't. And his whole thing was, we've standardized the typewriter, where the keys are in the typewriter. The railroads are standardized by time and by gauge of the track. And now we're trying to do that with races. We're trying to say that they're all the same. It was a scientific racist argument, but nevertheless. But that's just an example. I mean, I spent time digging, and by golly, I found his friend's paper where he talked about standardizing races like the railroad.
A great aha moment. You think, wow, I did it. I got it. I've solved this problem by perseverance.
Yeah, and then you end up with one footnote of 2 sentences
that maybe nobody ever reads, but gives you great satisfaction. But also remember, early in the internet, I'm looking at Estelle Real in your index, you would say Estelle plus Real plus Indian plus education. Today Google, the artificial intelligence is such that they can intuit much of what you're looking for. So let's talk about the book per se. You knew a lot about this, of course. This has been a subject that's been of interest to you, even when you were a very busy college administrator. What did you learn in this process, Larry?
Wow. Well, I learned a lot. I think the one thing, well, first, let me just talk about the mechanics. I really learned how to do research on the internet. I mean, because I figured that I was going to have to figure that out, and I did. And again, during COVID, it was really important that I got a little bit savvy in doing it. What I really learned more than anything, I think, is that at the turn of the century, this scientific racism that just had completely taken control of education, whether it was elementary education, secondary education, higher education, scientific racism had taken over. And then what I found very interesting, as I'm reading this about Indian educators, repeatedly, they're talking about immigrants. Repeatedly, they're tying their struggle in Indian education to the educator in New York City that's dealing with the Italian immigrant. And they really, for a very short period of time, from 1900 to 1909, the realization by Indian school educators that they were struggling with the same thing that educators in Boston and New York and other places were dealing with, that it was the same. And those educators then in the public schools of those major cities were looking at the Indian schools and were saying, I think they've figured it out. And so what we see happening in the latter half of this 2-volume set, what we see happening is then the Indian educators are now giving presentations to the public school educators on how best to employ industrial education in their schools.
These are models of what we should try to adopt. So Larry, just to make sure our listeners really understand this, I know you touched on it before, but in the shortest possible terms, define scientific racism.
Let's start with Darwinism. So Darwin talks about evolution. And because there's evolution, species develop over time. So scientific racism took Darwinism then and said that applied to humans too, that humans developed over time. But then the issue is that different races, and again, Boas would say there's only one race. We're part of the human race.
Boas of Columbia University, one of the great anthropologists of the 20th century.
Yeah. Thanks for filling those in for me, Clay.
I'm the listener's advocate.
Yeah. Thank you. The idea that races developed separately. And so, by 1900, educated Americans could show you a chart that showed the Anglo-Saxon at the top, and then all the way down. They had a spot for the Asians. They had a spot for the American Indians. They had a spot for those of African descent. And so I guess it's racism because it's dividing us into races. And they believed it was based on science. And by the way, this whole thing opens up a whole nother conversation about genetics.
Eugenics. I was about to ask, what does this have to do with eugenics?
Eugenics. So the whole idea of eugenics, and Estelle Real had her own idea of eugenics. She believed that the answer, and you mentioned the Indian problem before, Estelle Real believed that the solution to the Indian problem was intermarriage, just like Thomas Jefferson had talked about, only now she's basing this on scientific racism. That if you get enough white blood into a person that has any native blood, eventually they will be able to do the same things that other whites can do. There were arguments in the early 1900s about successful black men in the United States. And it said, well, of course these guys are successful because they've got all this white blood in them. If they didn't have the white blood in them, they wouldn't be successful. And so Estelle Real signed on to this immediately. She talked about it in 1898 when she became superintendent of Indian schools, that the solution to the Indian problem was intermarriage with Indians and whites. And after she left the office in 1910, she was given interviews and she was saying the exact same thing.
There are still Indian boarding schools. They've changed their charters and their missions pretty dramatically. When did this full court press for assimilation begin to fade away from American policy?
Well, I don't know if it's ever faded away. I mean, I think today you and I could walk downtown and have a conversation on the street, and there would be people who would tell us we need to get rid of the reservations. The Indians just need to be part of our society, and they have to stop being Indians. I mean, you and I would hear arguments for that today.
We've been through this together, and many people think, get over it already. That I know people who think that reservations are failed socialism, as they call it, that they're disasters, that the sooner we terminate, which was an actual policy during the 1950s, these reservations, the better, that it's time for natives to get over it and get on board. And I think the white community continues to believe, come on, don't you want the fruits of white civilization with security and better housing and access to things? Why would you want to cling to a set of traditions that hold your culture back? I think that's a very widespread view in America, particularly in red in red states, but not just there, right?
Right. You and I both had these conversations with folks that just believe, and I've had these conversations with very powerful people that believe that
I know.
that believe that, we just need to get rid of the reservations. Once we get rid of the reservations and the Indians live within our society, and what they look at, and it's a real tragedy, Clay, that we talk and say that this is still going on. This is 2024, and this conversation could have been had in 1890, could have been had in 1930 and 1950, as you mentioned, the whole termination thing. And here we are in 2024, and we could still have that conversation. And those people would say, well, look, look down your street. You've got people that are Germans here, and you've got people that are Norwegians, and you've got people that are Russians. And now look, you all live on the same street here. And, it would just be a house that would have a family of Indians in it. They wouldn't be out on the reservation. Of course, 3/4 of American Indians do not live on reservations today. I don't think most people know that. They live in communities. I think the MHA Nation.
And that's the Arikara, North Dakota people.
I think that population in the Bismarck-Mandan area is larger than it is on the reservation.
And yet it's largely an invisible part of the community, so that white people, non-Indians, don't really see natives except in the places where they are sure they're going to see them. And so there's a kind of a sort of silent population that exists in our cities, in Minneapolis, in Los Angeles, in Bismarck, in Omaha, who no longer live on reservations. At least 70% are not on reservations, but they are not very visible.
Right. Many, many years ago, I was in the Taos Pueblo in New Mexico, many years ago. I wanted to see the canes. So the Pueblos, to show their authority, they received canes, and they got their first cane from Spain, then they got their next cane from Mexico, then they got the next cane from the United States, then they got a cane from Lincoln to keep them in the Union, and then they got a cane from Jimmy Carter, which is the last cane they got. So I wanted to see all these canes, and so I'm hunting around, and somebody finally points me to the lieutenant governor. And I go to him and I explain that I want to see the canes. He was quite surprised that anybody knew about the canes. But anyway, we went into the governor's office. The governor was out of town. Went in the governor's office and he got to take canes and I got to have a picture of them. And it was all really great. Anyway, my point in what you've just brought up is I asked him, I said, so have you always lived in Taos? And he, oh, no, he said, I was up in Detroit. He said, I've lived most of my life in Detroit. He said, but I grew up here. And he said, for us, he said, our Pueblo is always our home. And I think that that's probably true about the reservations too. I think if we were to talk to folks that are Lakota, that live in Bismarck, that they may be enrolled and their family history is in Standing Rock, and that is always their home, even though they live in Bismarck. Now, I shouldn't be saying this. I'm speculating on this as the white guy.
Natives have talked to you that, I mean, you're not working from a vacuum here. This is not mere invention. So, you've said a couple of times, we're a couple of white guys. We aren't the best people to be having these conversations, but we're having them because they need to be had, and everyone needs to be part of it. And one of the things that African Americans say and Native Americans say is it's not up to us to educate you white people. You white people have to learn to educate yourselves about these things. And so I deeply respect the work that you've done, and I know there's a catch. You feel a little sheepish about anytime we stray into trying to figure out what Native people believe or want, and that's a really good caution and humility, Larry, but you know that the work you're doing is important and it has the opportunity to lay the groundwork of new understandings of the history of white-Indian relations in America.
Well, that's certainly what we hope for. I was very honored when Russ McDonald, the president of United Tribes Technical College, provided me a blurb for this.
Yeah.
And Russ got very involved in, I've got a blurb on the book from the president of the National Education Association. And Russ was a big part of getting that done by testifying to her, providing a testimonial to her that this was important work from a Native perspective as well. And I hope it is, and I hope it increases an understanding across the board between the larger white community. I don't look at Indian schools and say that we have to fault the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of the people that taught in these Indian schools. That's not the purpose of this, but it's to help us understand better what was going on at that time and what the educators were thinking at that time. And I hope it's helpful in educating all communities on what was going on in the Indian schools.
So when you were growing up, there was still a heavy assimilationist, almost a consensus about assimilation in the non-Indian population in the United States. That's changed dramatically during your lifetime. There's greater sensitivity amongst non-Indians towards Indian rights, Indian sovereignty. Sovereignty wouldn't even have been understood in 1950 by most white people. There's a kind of Indian cultural renaissance going on. Things are really improved dramatically. I'm not trying to be Pollyanna, but they have, you will acknowledge, changed in your lifetime in a way that could not have been predicted.
That's correct. Here's what I'm afraid of. You said you wanted to end on a high note, but here's what I'm afraid of is we have seen unbelievable backlash in this country about people of color and about immigration. So I had a conversation in California here a few months ago with a native. And I just asked him, I said, are you afraid that this backlash will eventually include natives? And he said, he said, natives have always been the canary in the mine. And so that really sent to me a message that this is a very sobering time for all of us, and that all of these great steps forward that you were just describing are not guaranteed. And everyone has to be vigilant to keep those strides, to keep them in place, so we're not taking 2 steps forward and 3 steps backwards.
I think that's exactly right, Larry, that 20 years ago we thought many things had been settled. Public lands policies, attitudes towards race, so they're certainly greatly improved. A new understanding of Native Americans and Native American rights. I think now, given the last tumultuous decade, all bets are off and we don't know where we're heading, but there are signs of retrogression and very grave retrogressions on every front, including perhaps the lives of Native Americans. I so celebrate your work, Larry. Second volume comes out when?
Well, 2025. I don't know when in 2025. So this is a long process, and so I'm hopeful that by summer or fall of 2025, the second volume will be out.
So people can get this book at University of Nebraska Press. To Educate American Indians, selected writings from the National Education Association's Department of Indian Education, 1900 to 1904, and a sequel coming. I wish you well, Larry, and thank you for providing important insight into this really essential subject as the nation moves towards its 250th birthday. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.